Hello and welcome to episode 1 of the history of Maritime Wrestling, from the early days of Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling to the present day of North Pro Canadian Wrestling and Capital City Wrestling. The goal is to cover every single promotion that's ever had shows in the Maritimes. Am I going to miss some? Maybe, but we're going to try. There is a strong chance that Joel and Corey will be on this series at some point because they know a lot about Maritime Wrestling, especially the newer promotions, so they might make an appearance during some of these episodes. Just like wrestling in 1990, it's going to be one episode a month, but it's not for 1 year. This is going to go until we're out of promotions. Originally, I was going to start off with Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling. That is until Corey Robshow found something on WrestlingData.com, and that's some cards from the early 1900s all the way to the 1950s. So we're going to look at these cards, some of the names in there, and this is going to be episode 1, the 1900s to the 1950s. The earliest card that we could find took place on February 26, 1904 in North Sydney, Nova Scotia, where D.R. Reed beat Hugh McDonald. Yes, 1904, there were matches in the Maritimes. The following month, on March 17th, 1904, Jack McLennan would beat D.R. Reed. The first shows to happen in New Brunswick would happen on October 18th, 1905 in St. John, New Brunswick, when Emil Maupus would take on Peter Hedger. Other wrestlers wrestling for the Maritimes in the 1900s include George Schnabel, Young Hackenschmidt, Eugene Hardy, Joe Gilbert, Billy Jordan, Tom Foley, Otto Opelt, Dan McDonald, Cyclone Burns, and Yankee Rogers. If you're like me and you don't really recognize any of these names from the 1900s, don't feel bad, but those were the wrestlers wrestling in the Maritimes from 1904 to 1909. The 1910s would see names like John Kilanis, Jim Smart, Cyclone Lewis, Daredevil Raymond, Roy McKay, John McLaughlin, Bridson Green, and Spiros Karavas. In the 1920s, I could only find one card. This was a card in St. John, New Brunswick, where Harry Catron faced off against Walter Toole to a time limit draw. The 1930s saw wrestlers like Bobby Mainford, George Taylor, Farmer McLeod, Boris Dimitrov, Dutch Green, Henry Erslinger, Joe Campbell, Stanislav Zabisco, Tommy Texas, Lee Wyckoff, Mike Yamka, Ed Don George, Bull Martin, John Spellman, Frank Sexton, George Zarnoff, Henry Piers, Leo Numa, and George McLeod. The first title match that I could find would be for the AWA Boston World Heavyweight Championship, as Yvon Robert defended the title versus Wally Dusick in Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1936. Yvon Robert was a massive star in Quebec and was a champion over there, and is probably the biggest name on the list so far. In 1938, Cowboy Len Hughes would start wrestling in the Maritimes. Len Hughes was a massive star in the Maritimes, and he would actually be the promoter and booker in the Maritimes before Emile Dupree would take over as promoter and booker in the early 1960s. In the 1940s, Cowboy Len Hughes would continue to be a huge star in Maritime Wrestling. Another personality wrestling for the Maritimes at this point in time is Al Zink. Al Zink would be another promoter and booker in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s for Maritime Wrestling. Other wrestlers wrestling in the Maritimes in the 1940s would include Angelo Savoldi, Bobby Nelson, Ali Pasha, Carol Krauser, Tommy Martindale, Joe Christie, Bull Curry, Tony Gaudette, Bull Montana, Larry Mucken, and Sal Balbo. By the 1950s, Cowboy Len Hughes is the established main eventer in the Maritimes. Other wrestlers wrestling in the Maritimes in the 1950s would include Angelo Savoldi, Mr. Canada, The Great Mephisto, Joe Christie, Bud Curtis, Chris Zaharia, Bobby Manigov, Yvon Robert, Guy LaRose, Ivan Rasputin, Tiny Mills, Eddie Auger, Daffy Daniels, Primo Carnera, Ted Germain, George Scott, Oyama Kato, Frank Taylor, The Mask, Lee Hennig, Tiger Tasker, Bob Geigel, Johnny Rougeau, The Great Togo, Tosh Togo, Antonino Rocca, Arnold Skolland, and in 1956 we would see the first appearance of Emile Dupree. He would eventually become the biggest star in Maritime Wrestling and the man that would popularize Maritime Wrestling in the 60s all the way to the 90s. Also in the 1950s, we would get the little wrestlers come in, the likes of Little Beaver, Sky Lolo, and Fuzzy Cupid. Other big stars that would wrestle in the Maritimes in 1956 would include Maurice Mad Dog Vachon and Hard-Boiled Haggerty. In 1957, Gypsy Joe would wrestle in the Maritimes. Gypsy Joe during this time period was considered the toughest wrestler in the world. Another legend would make his way to the Maritimes in 1957. This would be Edouard Carpentier. He fought Gypsy Joe on June 3rd, 1957. 11 days later, Carpentier would be the world heavyweight champion. On June 10th, 1957, the Maritimes would get Gene Kiniski versus Pat O'Connor. These are two future world heavyweight champions. In 1958, Killer Kowalski would wrestle in the Maritimes. Also wrestling in the Maritime at this point was the original Sheik, Ed Farhat. You might know him best as the uncle of Sabu and also the trainer of Rob Van Dam. In 1959, the largest wrestler to ever live would make his way to the Maritimes. This was 800 pounds Happy Humphrey. Happy Humphrey would take on another super heavyweight in the Maritimes, the 400 pounds Mighty Jumbo. The early 1960s would see stars like the first ever WWF Intercontinental Champion Pat Patterson and former boxer Yvon Durel make their way to the Maritimes. But the biggest news that would happen in the early 60s would be Emile Dupree taking over the territory from Cowboy Len Hughes. There's a lot of rumors on how Emile got the territory from Len Hughes, and we will cover that in episode 2 as we cover Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling from the early 1960s to 1990. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next week.